Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Lovely to see you. My name's Vix. I'm hosting the session today. As a quick reminder, any Q&A you can find on the app, so please do, because I will be monitoring it throughout the session. I'd like to welcome you to how to secure iPads today with our lovely Victor. Fun fact. I haven't got one. Oh, they need to give that to you. Sorry, darling. Fun fact about our Victor is that he's a Bill Murray fan. I did have to ask the question, was that the actor? But apparently not, it is a band. Who knew? Anyway, I'd like to welcome Victor to the stage. Enjoy.
Thank you, Yuan. Good morning. So, imagine this. A friend asks you, hey, I need to borrow your iPad. So you're a nice person, so you're like, hey, for sure, go ahead. Here's my passcode, have at it. What do you think's gonna happen when you get that iPad back, right? Now let's hope you get it back because iPads are really cool and expensive. But when you get it back, you'll probably notice a few things. One, your apps will be all over the place. They'll probably be missing. They'll probably be uninstalled. You'll go into your Apple keychain and you'll try to find your passwords, but your passwords have been overwritten with their passwords. On top of that, you have a ton of photos of your friend's dog and other people. You have no idea who they are. And to make matters even worse is that you get a billing statement from iTunes for $500 for Robux. That's wild. So we all know that iPads are amazing, powerful, and very personal devices. So we need to treat them as such when we are also deploying them into the enterprise for our users as well as our customers. Hi everyone, of course, as she mentioned, I am Victor Mendez. I'm a service desk technician for my organization. And today, of course, we're gonna be going over how to securely deploy iPads with shared iPad and single app mode. So we're gonna go over in this session, which is essentially just like a beginner session, really, for how to get each iPad set up in each mode. Also how to essentially secure them using different configuration profiles and settings that we can find within Jamf Pro. And then of course, I'm gonna give you some tips and tricks that can help you deploy these iPads as quickly as possible. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into it. So of course, we have the first mode, which is gonna be single app mode. And let's kind of break down essentially what a single app mode iPad is. And essentially, it's basically an iPad that you deployed that is locked down to just one singular app. This could be almost any app that you have installed or deployed onto that iPad. And of course, you'll set that up in the configuration setting, which we'll get to later on. But there are also restrictions, of course, when it comes to interactivity between this iPad. When we are deploying an iPad in single app mode, we're essentially just telling the user, this is the only app that you're gonna be interfacing with the iPad. And this is very important for several different reasons, right? For iPads that we are not securely deploying and we are just kind of jumping out there into the wild with and not giving the proper restrictions to, that allows essentially the user to be able to do anything that they want with the iPad. It could mean like being able to sign up for iCloud or open up any apps, and it essentially almost becomes a toy because some of the users that are out there who have parents and young children, they'll see that iPad and they're just gonna start playing around with it. And that's not gonna allow other users who typically wanna get stuff done, who wanna be productive, especially in an environment too, where you're trying to make a sale. So this is why some of the great use cases for this kind of iPad configuration is really great for something like a self-service, right? We can go ahead and deploy this as something like a kiosk for our users or for our customers, and that can help drive a sale. We definitely want to try to lock down the iPad as much as possible so we can try to control the user experience for that individual, so that way we can try to drive exactly what the purpose of this iPad truly is, to help your customers out, help them with either shopping or browsing your catalog or inventory, and even when it comes to banking, perhaps a user is confused about how to utilize your certain application, or they just need help with navigating around it. We can lock down with a single app mode to your banking application or to your specific banking web page to be able to show them around and help them to be able to use that on their own personal devices. So for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to be looking at one app that I found very successful within our environment, which is called the Kiosk Pro Plus app. It's essentially just a web browser application where it gives you some more configurations underneath the surface there. So one of the things that we can actually do with the Kiosk Pro app is going to be to essentially manage idle times, right? So you have a single app mode iPad, you have the web browser up and loaded with perhaps something like your website, and you want that session to be able to reset every so often. And of course, the reason is that we want every new customer who walks up to the iPad be introduced with a welcoming screen that's going to be more inviting to them, so that way they can know that it's safe and it's fun for them to be able to interact with. When we are giving that type of experience to every single user or a specific customer, then they're going to be really lost and confused as far as what web page is out there. So Kiosk Pro Plus within the app, you can actually configure that after so many seconds of interactivity that the app will essentially reset itself. It'll go back into the home screen or to whatever home page you set it up as. It'll be ready for that next customer to be able to start browsing and do what other kind of productive things that they want to go and get to do with it. One other really great use case for this also too is the managed screen wake times, right? So perhaps you have this iPad and it's just the screen is on and it's on 100% all the time. One of the issues that can actually come about with this is that you're essentially introducing the iPad to be susceptible to burn-in. It can and sometimes will happen depending on how long we're actually keeping it. I mean, surprisingly, they can go a really long time, but we don't want to try to lessen the life of the iPad. We definitely want to try to keep it around for as long as possible. So being able to manage the screen and wake times between the hours of perhaps your business's service hours will definitely help to prolong the lifespan of that device. It also kind of lets people know that you're closing up shop, so they need to go ahead and just start moving away now. One of the other important aspects of the Kiosk Pro Plus app is just the way that it's able to handle downloads. This is something that's really risky, something that's really tricky for some organizations to kind of get around, where you don't want personal information or confidential information about a specific user or a specific customer to be able to have access to between other people, right? So what the Kiosk Pro Plus app does essentially is if, say, a user is looking up something like a billing statement or some other personal information on there, something like a PDF, it's going to launch it into a new tab, and it's not going to be downloaded or accessible to another user within something like the Files app, which is typically where some of those documents get saved into if a user were prompted to open up such files, right? So in this case, being able to restrict downloads and also being able to ensure that the session is going to be wiped, it's going to be reset, then all those tabs, all that information essentially get cleared, and we're not going to have to worry about another customer being able to have access to that information. So that's single app mode. But what about shared iPad mode? What are some of the use cases for that? And also, what is it? Well, very simply, it just allows the users to be able to, or I should say multiple users, to be able to log in and sign in to one singular iPad. So this would be something shared between different employees or within entire departments of your organization. And this is something that's going to be managed using Apple Business Managed Apple IDs, right? And one other key aspect of the shared iPad mode that we've liked to leverage in our organization is to be able to use the guest accounts. So the guest account is essentially, just like in the Mac if you've seen it, is that it's just a temporary session for users to be able to log into that don't own or have any access to that iPad and be able to use it with all their data and information securely being wiped once that user logs out of it. So this is really, really cool, of course, because we can have multiple outside users, we can have multiple outside customers come in, utilize that guest user session, and then by the time they log out, they're not going to have to worry about their information staying or being accessible to another person or within anyone else on your organization. But there's also temporary only sessions, which is really great. So for some iPads, or perhaps for when you are seeing different customers, and you want to be able for them to be able to have access to more of the capabilities of the iPad, or perhaps you have multiple apps that you want to showcase to a customer, then being able to utilize a temporary session with shared iPad mode can help you or enable you to be able to do so. So you can have all the apps deployed into the shared iPad, and then from there, you can go ahead and have them sign into the temporary session, or have, of course, an employee from your organization go ahead and sign them into it, so that way they can start playing around with the specific apps that you've determined that they need to have access to in order to be productive within that session, right? And just like shared iPad mode, we also have some other settings that we can configure that allows them to manage, or allows us to manage the idle times, removes, of course, the previous session data, and also starts a session for a new user. So in some cases, you may want to make this session a little bit longer than something that you would have on a shared iPad. As in this case, at least for our organization, so we've been able to successfully been deploying the shared iPads between our employees directly to the customers. We can go ahead and hand them the iPad to let them know that this is an iPad that they can go ahead and utilize safely with the different apps that we have installed on them. And then by the time they return it back to us, our employee will go ahead and log them out. But of course, mistakes can happen, and we definitely do not want that temporary session to remain accessible to another user. If for whatever reason it's a really busy day and your employee may sometimes forget that, hey, this last customer just used this iPad and they didn't log out, well, what's going to happen, of course, is the next user is going to come in, they're going to sign into that temporary session, and they're going to see exactly all that data. But what's really great, though, is that we can also manage the idle times, right? So within this option, we can go ahead and say within this number of minutes or seconds that we're going to close out, or we're going to automatically log out that user session so that way it's ready and available for the next customer. So now let's kind of get into some of the setup process of this, right? So one, you're going to need two things. You're going to need, of course, the two pre-stage enrollments. You're going to need the pre-stage enrollments for your single app iPad, and in this case, when we go into the pre-stage enrollment settings within Jamf Pro, one of the main key options that you're going to, of course, uncheck is going to be the enable shared iPad setting, because we want this for the single app mode iPad. And then, of course, we like to require the credentials for setting up the iPad. So when it's going in through the MDM, it's hitting the pre-stage for your Jamf Pro tenant. We want to ensure that only access or accessible users within our organization have the ability to be able to set up and use that iPad. We don't want to give any customers or anyone else from outside the organization the ability to go ahead and reset and set up that iPad for themselves, because obviously it's not for them. Now, another setting we can also go ahead and look into as well is being able to pair to an unsupervised device or a device that does not belong within your organization. And this kind of brings me to another point I'd like to make, which is also the physical security of the iPads, of where they are located within your organization that is available to the users to use. So if you remember in one of the previous pictures I saw there, you would see the iPad that was essentially locked up in a case or locked up in some sort of kiosk-looking device that essentially blocks physical aspects to the iPad itself, such as, of course, the most importantly, the lightning ports or the home button, if it has a home button. Essentially because giving physical access to some of these buttons or some of these options can allow some users from the outside to be able to reset the iPad or set it up into DFU mode, which would, of course, once again, be terrible, because now you're going to have to take time to go out there and reset up that iPad again. And of course, we don't want to give any of the customers the upper hand in trying to steal the iPad from you or your organization. So there's something very important to kind of keep in mind. I know the Kiosk group, the ones that actually deploy or create the app for the Kiosk Pro Plus, do have some pretty good options. But of course, there's a lot of other third-party options out there that you can go ahead and look at that even allow you to set up your digital signage for your organization. So that way it looks like, of course, this iPad is from and being provided by your company. So it makes the user experience look really cool and seamless, of course. But then, of course, we can also go ahead and prevent unenrollment as well. We don't want to give any users or any other customers the ability to go ahead and just unenroll that iPad or remove itself from the MDM. That would be awful. And then, of course, there's activation lock. An activation lock, if you don't know, of course, is an Apple protection security feature that allows users with an iCloud account to essentially enable Find My, which then gives that user the access to remotely see that iPad and then also be able to remotely reset it. And so that the way that the next time, of course, when someone goes in to try to set up that iPad, they're going to essentially be blocked with that Apple ID. Now, of course, thankfully, when we are supervising these devices, we do have the option to bypass those. But in any case, it's always something very important to do. And of course, we want to also be able to ensure that we're activating or using activation lock within our MDM server using the MDM server token. So when you've created your location within Jamf Pro and you have set that up using Apple Business Manager, one of the Apple Business Manager, the account that you are using to create that is going to be the Apple ID. That's going to be essentially locking down and enabling activation lock on that iPad, which is a very important note to take, is that when, of course, when you're going through setting up Jamf Pro, setting up all these configurations, is essentially that you want to ensure that you are using a shared admin account between your company, something that, of course, that only a few users are going to have access to. And so that way, of course, that account is the only one that's going to be responsible for having the essentially the password for activation lock when it comes down to it. Of course, though, when you do go back and reset iPads, we do have the option to reset that iPad by removing activation lock, so we don't have to go through the whole process of having to type in the admin password for the MDM server token. So now let's go ahead and get into shared iPad. And of course, key thing here is just going to ahead and just simply check enable shared iPad, and bam, there we go. Now we have an enable shared iPad ready to go for this pre-stage, and we're essentially going to have some of the same configurations as before. And in our use case, we've definitely used the temporary session only, of course, and also the set session timeout. Like I was saying, we definitely want to ensure that no mistakes are being made. We don't want to allow customers to accidentally forget that their information was just saved or downloaded or accessible on that iPad. Anything that was cached or even placed into the keychain, we want all of that to just be wiped out completely. So setting the session timeout is definitely going to be very handy to ensure that your customer's information or anyone else's information on that iPad gets securely wiped for that. So that's pretty easy. So we already got the 2 pre-stage enrollments set up. So now let's look at something when it comes to the single app mode, which is also deploying the single app that we're going to be using to lock down that single app mode iPad. One really great feature within Jamf Pro is going to be the configuration profile that we have for deploying that single app mode, which is going to be the XML and app configuration settings. So when we tap or you when you click on this tab, you're essentially going to be presented with a really large blank box. And this box essentially allows you to input something such as an XML. So for the Kiosk Pro Plus app, it makes it really, really simple to be able to do this. So you're going to have pretty much just like a test iPad that's going to have the Kiosk Pro Plus app installed on it. With that application, you're going to go through the admin settings of that app, and you're going to just start configuring everything you want it to do. You're going to change the colors of it. You're going to enable the little AirPrint on it. Perhaps if you want users to be able to have access to an AirPrinter to print out some information, you're going to, of course, set up the screen lock settings, or I should say the screen wake and sleep settings on there, so that way during the certain times of the day that the iPad is not staying awake all the time. Once you have all those settings configured within that single app, then you can just simply export that XML within the application itself. Easiest way to do that, of course, is to airdrop it. So once you airdrop that XML, something to perhaps your personal Mac computer, or your, I should say, enterprise Mac computer, then you're going to go ahead and use that text file. You're going to open it. You're going to go ahead and copy all the data from it and paste it directly into that box. From there, anytime you deploy that app, it's going to be configured with the same configuration settings that we just used or got set up with that app that was deployed before on that other app that you went ahead and transferred all the settings to. So very easy. That way you're not having to go through every single different iPad, having to set up or change the same settings over and over and over again. It just makes the process so much more easier. So yeah, awesome for that. And then of course, there's going to be other configuration profiles. Now, when I'm up here talking today about the different configuration profiles that you want to use for your iPads, I'm just going to talk mostly about some of my personal experience with some of these settings. And some of them may be a little bit redundant. You may go like, oh, hey, Victor, but this setting kind of already like fulfills this type of thing. And so it's kind of a little bit redundant. I don't really care. For me, I'm just like, I do not want any stone left unturned. I don't want to give anyone the opportunity to go, hey, this is going to be my iPad, now I have it, haha. So we're just going to go ahead and restrict all the things so that way we control the user interaction and we can ensure that this iPad is going to be used for productivity. But we do have to be careful because sometimes things can often get overlooked. For example, within the restrictions payload, we can restrict access to the camera. And when we restrict access to the camera, if your website or another website that you are allowing users to be able to have access to requires that they do use the camera to perhaps scan something, take a picture of something, to be able to upload somewhere, then we do need to be aware that, of course, the camera is going to need to be accessible to that user. Otherwise, it's going to just crash that whole website. We don't want that to happen, and that's going to look really bad. Of course, there's also other settings we can also look into, which is AirPrints. Now, of course, if you are allowing AirPrint to be accessible to a user, I would definitely recommend don't do it like on some sort of public Wi-Fi that everyone else has access to. Put it on a separate Wi-Fi that only you and your admins know the password to. So that way we can securely have that iPad and that AirPrinter set up on the same network. So that way they can talk to each other and they can securely print as well. But when it comes to those hidden networks, we also want to ensure that we set up a managed Wi-Fi network profile on there, or one of the payload settings. And now this is something that I have had, I've made many mistakes with, and I'm really glad that Jamf warns you when you set up a configuration profile with this Wi-Fi payload restriction settings, because if you end up deploying this setting without specifying a specific shared or specific Wi-Fi network, then you're going to essentially almost lock out your iPad entirely, because it's going to be locked down to essentially no managed Wi-Fi networks, and it's just not going to connect to any Wi-Fi at all. It won't let you go into the Wi-Fi settings to connect to any sort of personal Wi-Fi network at all. So that iPad is, may or may not have to be wiped at that point in order for you to regain access to be able to essentially be able to set it back up again to where you need it, or you can start using it again. There will be some workarounds that we can actually use, though, that can kind of help you with being able to troubleshoot that. But once again, may or may not be a security concern, but we'll get into that. So we talked about the managed Wi-Fi networks, but then also, of course, pairing with no supervised configured host. This, once again, goes along with the physical security aspect of the iPad. If we're handing users the iPad and we're not really supervising them, we're not really seeing what they're doing, there's nothing that's going to really essentially stop them from being able to pull out their own Mac, connect it over to there and be like, oh, hey, now let me just go ahead and reset this Mac computer. So, of course, when it comes to pairing with a no supervised configured host, I should say, we're essentially only allowing the iPad to pair with those that are going to have that certificate that you get within your MDM that's going to allow you to supervise that supervision identity, I should say, within your keychain. And the iPad is only going to be able to pair with your Macs that are going to have that same supervision identity placed within your Mac's keychain. So being able to have that on there is going to be key to being able to help you secure and only ensure that only the authorized users are going to have access to pair and wipe that device when necessary. And then, of course, there's booting into the recovery by an unpaired device. Essentially, if that iPad, this kind of more so is something that you would have to worry about with a iPad that is locked. For some of the single app mode, it may or may not apply really, but since it's already essentially unlocked, and so it can essentially almost like pair to it. But that's why, of course, before we went ahead and restricted to be able to, not allow any pairing with the no supervision configured host. So it's always good to have that. And then, of course, there is the rapid security response update, something that Apple recently started releasing to all of their devices, which is essentially just a little anecdote on the current release that is identified by a letter. We definitely want to ensure that our iPads and all our devices within our environment are quickly updated as fast as possible and have the latest security updates for all those devices, just in case that we can, of course, squash any sort of bugs or any sort of vulnerabilities that may be present. We just want to make sure that we do that as quickly as possible. But there's also another setting on there that allows users to remove the security response update. I wouldn't recommend doing that, of course, if you are testing, which of course you should. You should have like a test iPad around that you can make sure that the iPad that you're utilizing or going to be deploying out there is working correctly with that update. So ensuring that, if you checked all that out, then I don't see any other reason to just go ahead and start updating all those iPads. So now let's go ahead and go into the configuration profiles for the shared iPad. Some of the configuration profiles that we also just mentioned kind of also apply to this as well. But one key thing I wanted to go ahead and bring out to you here is also selecting the apps, of course, that you want the users to have or have access to. This is, I think, very important for our customers, especially because sometimes when you may deploy apps to it and you just left all the system apps installed onto it, the whole iPad screen is going to be cluttered with a bunch of apps that may not actually really be needed by the user. And we don't want the user to be confused as far as like what they're needing to do or what they need to look for. And then some apps can even appear in the app drawer if you've seen it, like where you swipe all the way over to the right and you have a whole bunch of like an app library on there. Most users just really don't know like where to get to that. They don't really like it. So I would just say, just go and block all the apps except for the ones that you are going to be deploying directly to that iPad. And then of course, configure them on the home screen. Usually you can put them like directly on the front, but I've always found it a lot easier if they're just directly there on the bottom on the dock there. So that way they can just, do a little swipe up there and they can go ahead and open up other apps that they need to, switch in between them more easier, things like that. And then of course we can go over some other restriction settings, right? Installing configuration profiles. This sometimes can be a surprise, but like if you have perhaps a user who has subscribed to Spectrum Wi-Fi, they actually deploy configuration profiles for their devices, which allows you to connect to other Spectrum hotspots. So we don't want users to go in there to just start downloading those configuration profiles and allowing them to have access to a whole assortment of other Wi-Fi configurations. And of course, once again, this may or may not be a little bit redundant because we've already established that we have managed Wi-Fi. At least we should, but if you're not, then just kind of be aware of this option. Now, of course, adding VPN configurations, we don't want them to be able to send all that traffic out somewhere else that we're not allowing them to. So one other thing about that as well as the iCloud options. So when it comes to iCloud, we don't want other users to be able to upload any personal information that may be, or is downloading information onto that iPad that we don't really want them to be able to have access to on our own personal devices. Now, last but not least, a USB restricted mode. So this may or may not be something that you'd want to disable or not. This can be a really good troubleshooting type of configuration that I found. Because once again, I tend to make mistakes. I tend to forget that when I am creating a configuration profile within the Wi-Fi settings, I forget sometimes to deploy the right Wi-Fi. Or, lo and behold, you remove that certain configuration profile. And then when you remove it, it doesn't have any Wi-Fi to actually connect to. So usually what I end up doing is I'm just like, let me go ahead and create one configuration profile that's going to have another managed Wi-Fi setting as a backup, just in case I have to remove that other one that has that managed Wi-Fi that I want that device to be able to have access to. You always want to do that first before we start removing those configuration profiles to also ensure that if you are AirPrinting, that device is going to be on the same network as your AirPrinter. And USB restricted mode, though, however, in this case, can also allow you to essentially bypass the Wi-Fi restriction settings by allowing your iPad to connect directly to LAN. So if you have like an iPad like 9th gen and below, then you can essentially buy a Lightning to Ethernet connection, connect it over to a LAN network, and then be able to have access to the Wi-Fi again and go, yay, now you can go ahead and like set up the proper configuration profiles and go from there. So this can happen, right? This is like, honestly, after talking to a lot of you guys here, this is nothing. Like, you guys out there are deploying thousands of iPads. I come from a very small city, so like this is like, I'll get this done in like by lunchtime, you know what I mean? But regardless, it is something that we still want to be aware of. We want to try to get these iPads out as quickly as possible, especially if we are swapping out the equipment, taking out the old, putting in some of the new. So of course, when it comes like to your boss asking like these types of requests, we definitely want to ensure we can deliver on time. So here's some tips that we can go ahead and do. We want to ensure that we have something like an M1 Mac Mini. We also want to have a powered USB hub. When you find or when you're searching for or shopping for a USB-A hub, you'll tend to find a lot like on Amazon. Don't buy those. Those are kind of junk. I've kind of went through a couple of those, like where it says like, oh, like 16, 24 ports, USB-A, 90 watts, and all this kind of stuff. But what ends up happening is that they really can't deliver all the power to like 24 or 16 iPads, so you only really end up with being able to connect 6 or so iPads to your Mac computer. There's actually a vendor here who is really great, Cambrionics, who they're in the expo hall. You can go visit them. They have some really great USB hubs that you can go ahead and utilize for being able to connect all these iPads directly to your Mac. So that way they can all show up within what is going to be the Apple Configurator 2 app. So having the Apple Configurator 2 app is going to help you with being able to essentially update, wipe, and get all these devices set up and ready to go for your pre-stage and help you deliver that process way more seamlessly. But of course, going back, having a service account for enrollments, key thing here. Don't use your own personal admin or use your accounts for this, because we don't want, of course, different users saying that this iPad belongs to them, then you having to go back in through inventory, having to clear those names, and it's just a mess. Just go have one admin account that's essentially going to be the one that's going to be responsible for enrolling those iPads and having those enrollment permissions for you, just so that way we can quickly move all those iPads and we have that one account that can easily bypass the activation and all that kind of stuff that we just spoke about, right? So smart groups is definitely going to be your friend. When we look at deploying all these different iPads and we look at all the different naming schemes on there, you'll notice, of course, you don't have too many options. When you wipe an iPad and you set it back up, the default name is going to be just iPad. Or you can set it to something like the serial number. This can help you in some cases with being able to find exactly which iPad you're looking at. But what I like about smart groups is that we can also go ahead and enable them to look for certain letters or combination of names. So that way we can scope to those smart groups and have all the configurations and all the policies, or I say the apps that we're deploying out to these iPads directly underneath that smart group. So we can choose something like a prefix or a suffix. In this case, for maybe my shared iPads, it's going to be XJ9. If you guys can tell me where that reference is from, I'd love to hear you guys try to find that. Or then the other one can be I don't know, 117 or something like that for all the other iPads. Just try to make it unique. Try to make it something that it's not going to be mistaken for another name of an iPad, because when that happens and there's a conflict, then you're going to end up with some iPads getting configured with the wrong configurations that you don't want to have. But we're essentially identifying that there's going to be one smart group for all the shared iPads, and there's going to be one smart group for all the single app mode iPads. And any time that an iPad gets deployed with that pre-stage, it's going to add in that prefix or that suffix that you set up on there. And then once it goes after that deployment and it sees all there in the smart group that all these iPads now have that name or letters attached to it, then everything else you have scoped to it is automatically going to get pushed out. It's automatically going to be deployed and installed. And you're not going to have to go back and have to individually go through every single type of app, every single type of configuration profile, and scope to every individual iPad. Because that can almost be like a security vulnerability in itself if you forget a step. Sometimes all these tasks can be so monotonous that we sometimes overlook certain steps that we need to obviously go through. And then, of course, once we start wrapping all this together, we're going to create a blueprint in Apple Configurator that enrolls all your iPads into Jamf. So when you're using Apple Configurator app on there, it's really cool. You just have all the iPads. You can just select all, and you can start wiping them. Of course, within Jamf, you're going to have it prepared so that way all the serial numbers that you're going to begin to wipe for all those iPads, you're going to start ensuring that they're going to get enrolled with that specific pre-stage. So maybe in one batch, you're going to go ahead and start wiping all the shared iPads, and in another batch, you're going to do all the single app mode iPads. So that way, those apps get the right suffix or prefix for the smart groups like we mentioned. And so once you've configured your blueprint, once you've kind of gone through all the settings and you've saved that onto your the Apple Configurator app, then you can just go ahead and quickly apply that blueprint to all those individual iPads. They all get wiped, then they all go through the enrollment process, they hit the pre-stage, they get that the smart group tag or the suffix and prefix, and then all the configurations, everything goes in there, and bam, now you have all your iPads set up and going. So that's it. Thank you all for listening. I really appreciate you guys, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.